morning, guys. My name is Kix, and I will teach you how to write idiotic Python. No, just kidding. But really, after Jeff's talk, there's Jeff, I'm really scared to show my code now. He might start sending me spam emails. So a little something about me. Over the past few years, I've worked as a Python full stack developer. Python is all that I've ever done ever since I got out of college. Actually, even before I got out of college, Python has been my first love, and it remains to be. A few years ago, I've been with a telecom startup as an engineering lead. I've also been with a game company as a web developer. Then I joined a real estate company as a platform engineer, a bunch of different shops that don't have anything to do with each other except that they use Python. So that's me. So my talk this morning is to try and convince you that you can use Python for just about everything and anything, regardless of what your teammates like to use, whatever language, whatever framework they use. You don't need to care. You can just use Python underneath. And this complements what Leo said earlier, that Python doesn't hate on other languages. We Pythonistas, we don't hate on them. Java is good, PHP is good. Instead, we take the strengths of those languages, incorporate them into our ecosystem, and make Python and whatever other language work together. So this is a story of random encounters and stuff that I've learned in my 6 or so years with startup worlds. We begin our story with Alice. Alice has a brilliant idea, one that will totally appeal to the millennial generation as well as the baby boomers. In fact, it's an idea that will appeal to just about everyone. She wants to build a web app for one thing that everybody loves: potatoes. Okay, it's an admirable premise. It's definitely something new. A web app, potato as a service, that's disruptive. No one has done that before. It has a lot of buzzwords such as fry science, chip engineering, mashed methodology. It's the startup to rule all startups, potatolist.io. And so we meet Bob. Bob is Alice's close friend and a rock star Python engineer, just like a lot of people here. Without hesitation, Bob jumped right into Alice's boat and started doing the initial design. He was so excited that in a few hours, he nailed down the database schema, entity relationship diagrams, data models. You name it, Bob does it. Except for one small thing. See, the thing is, Bob doesn't do front end. But Alice doesn't know that. In Alice's eye, Bob does everything. Not being a technical person herself, Alice just told Bob, Bob, I'll take care of marketing. I'll take care of our brand equity. You take care of technical. You do everything. I know you can do it. And then she gave Bob a pat on the shoulder and softly whispered, "We launch in 1 week." Okay, not a big deal. So, Bob went and downed a bottle of gin bilog. Bob sets off to try and learn HTML5, ES6, CSS3 in a few days. Yarn is the best new package manager for Node.js. Babel, Brunch, Bootstrap, React, Redux, Promises, Bluebird. All those nice packages, and boy, oh boy, did Bob struggle. I mean, come on. Bob has been a backend engineer all his life, and he wants to learn all that stuff. It takes a special kind of genius to be able to learn that in a month, much less a week. And perhaps, like most of us, well, Bob is not that kind of genius. So what happens? In full 3 days, Bob has not achieved anything usable. I mean, is anybody surprised by that? Only 4 days to go until launch, and Bob just has a basic hello world page with a hello button, but it's a React component, so that's that. And it's clickable. It's not connected to backend. Bob hasn't learned to do that yet, and Bob is getting pretty desperate. Bob decides to come clean and tell Alice. And Alice goes all out on Bob. And after downing another bottle of gin bilog, they decide to call it a day. Early the following morning, Alice calls Bob. Hey, great news, Bob. I found the perfect guy to help us out on this, and he's doing it for free in exchange for equity. Bob is stunned in amazement. What? Yeah, Alice said. Remember Carding? Carding is my ex-office mate, seatmate's neighbor's CrossFit buddy, Starbucks buddy that I told you about a week ago. He's great. And guys, by all intents and purposes, Carding is great. I mean, he can transform mediocre PDFs into stunning HTML5 pages. He knows solid front end, and his JavaScript game is on point. Except for one small thing. Carding doesn't know Python, and Carding would refuse to touch any Python code. He insists by stomping his foot on the ground that Node.js is the best web server and we should only work with Node.js. Python, let's use Node. So one more day passed and they achieved nothing. Aside from an Express.js shell and a static front end, nothing. Because of their differences, Bob and Carding find it very hard to work with each other. And so they're at a stalemate. Just when Bob and Carding finally decide and settle for a compromise, hey, okay, let's just make our web apps. My Python code will talk to your JavaScript code using SQL, something like that. Alice calls them. She sets up a Zoom meeting and slaps them with a ridiculous new requirement. The data must be flexible, that is, it should be adjustable. To please the investors, the data must be presented and must be edited arbitrarily, wink wink, and must stay consistent across the platform, which means now they can't just use plain SQL to make their apps talk without resorting to views and in-DB computations, which means that modifications on Bob's data models must now also be copied over to Carding's ORM, and it would be literally hellish to keep track. Can you just imagine an ORM written in JavaScript and another ORM written in Python sharing the exact same database? But that's not all. To make matters worse, Alice decides to hire Dodong, an admittedly excellent data scientist. And Dodong has his own special quirk. Dodong only codes in Python 3. He maintains that the sheer, and I quote, that the sheer cluster fuckery of Python 2 renders it unusable. Python 3 is lean, easily idiomatic, and a breeze to use. And besides, Dodong says that all his self-made libraries are written in Python 3. And even using tools such as 2 to 3 and 6, it just won't work with Bob's dirty, messy code. And with only 2 days left and without prior Python 3 knowledge, Bob refuses to port his code, and Alice demands pie charts. Pie charts and business intelligence for my investor pitch, she says. 2 days to go and still at a standstill. And so refusing to give in, Bob decides to pull another all-nighter, search the net for answers, going to Quora, RPython, Hacker News, Stack Overflow, even some obscure mailing lists and IRC channels to find a solution to their seemingly unsolvable dilemma. After 3 bottles of Cobra, a pack of Marlboros, and a few hours later, Bob closes his laptop, content, ready for launch. Carding and Dodong couldn't believe what they just heard. Bob, who codes in Python 2, found a way to make all their code work together seamlessly. Bob showed them the code on his laptop, instances of their code working without a hitch on all the different languages, Python 2, well, not really different, Python 2, Python 3, and JavaScript. Like magic, they're working together. And in fact, let me quickly show you what Dodong did. So here is Dodong's MVP. It's called Potato List. And as you can see, it's running on port 3000, and it lets you do stuff such as delete the potato, add the potato type. Forgive me, it's hard to type with one finger. Count, say 15. and shape, say, red, because red is a shape, apparently. So now we have PyCon potato 15 red. This is served on an Express.js front end fetched from a Python backend. And we have a charting server running on port 9000 and Python 3. So how did it work? And thus, the million-dollar question, what sorcery is this? Oh, great, now I have to wait for the animations again. Oh my God. What sorcery is this? What is the point of all this long and ridiculous build-up? What sorcery is this? How did Bob get all their code to work together without porting everything to just one same language? Meet Zero RPC. Some of you may have heard of it, some of you may have not. But it's an easy-to-use, intuitive, cross-language remote procedure call protocol. It was debuted in PyCon USA 2012 by Jerome Petazzoni, and in a nutshell, what it does is exactly what its name says. It lets you do remote procedure calls, regardless of what your caller's language is and what your server's language is and where they are, which means that even if you're inside a Node.js project, you can invoke functions from a Python project as if they were part of your code and without changing the function signature. So how does it work? As with traditional socket programming, you have a client process, you have a server process, and in the server process, you define procedures. Hence, the procedure in remote procedure call, which is just an old people's term for functions. You expose these procedures through Zero RPC and a client which knows which procedures to call and send an invocation or a remote procedure call, that's why it's called that, on the server and wait for the result. In Zero RPC, the request is serialized with message pack sent through Zero MQ to the other side, deserialized, processed, and goes back the same way. Server doesn't have to be any specific language. Client doesn't have to either. All you really have to know is that there's a function named this on the server that this client can call. The way that Zero RPC works is genius. While most RPC protocols rely on daemonized brokers such as RabbitMQ, Redis, like the way that Celery works, I know that a lot of us use Celery, or rely on a shared schema like Protobuf and Cap and Proto, two very good RPC protocols and serialization protocols, by the way. They're really fast, but pretty hard to use. Zero RPC utilizes the genius Zero Message Queue, which is just a tiny cross-platform language, a cross-language library that's higher level than basic socket programming, exposes pub/sub, push-pull, router dealer, and has high-speed async engines. The cool thing about Zero MQ is that it has flavors on most known languages, so you can just pick one language that you like, pick another, and you can make them work without having to modify much of the code. So this is how Bob solved this stalemate. He installed Zero RPC package for Node.js and Python. Yes, it works on both Python 2 and 3. Made his data models, and ORM the Zero RPC server. So underneath it all is the code that Bob wrote, and it runs as a Zero RPC server, and made both Node.js and Python 3 clients. So I'm going to show you the code that Bob wrote. But by this time, Bob and Dodong are afraid that Jeff might send them spam emails. So Bob and Dodong apologize in advance. Okay, so can you guys read this? I hope you can. Yeah, I think. So this is Bob's code. It's just a very basic DB server. It's just a base class. Doesn't inherit from anything else other than the base object. And it runs TinyDB. TinyDB is just a JSON file which you can perform queries on, much like you would on a MongoDB, but on a flat file. And it exposes the following functions. So Dodong's Bob server has get all potatoes, search potato, create potato, update potato, delete potato. CRUD potato, basically. And this is written on his Python 2 code. At the bottom, we have this invocation that runs it as a server. And let's look at the Express.js code. So here we go. This is an Express.js. There's also a 0RPC package for it. And the index does is it invokes get all potatoes. Remember the function in our Python server? It invokes that, waits for the response, compiles a template, and then shows that. Same with delete, same with update, update get and update post. Same with add, and it listens on port 3000. So if you remember, this is the code that does this. So it's an Express.js, guys. I'm not trying to pull the trick on you. It's real. Believe me. And the analytics server that Dodong wrote. So it's supposedly Python 3, but I don't know. I haven't really used Python 3 that much, except for this one thing. It runs the Sonic framework, which supposedly is one of the fastest web frameworks out there, since it uses this fancy new async def feature. And all it really does is that it renders a pie chart from all the potatoes in the server and send it as an SVG image. That's why you have this fancy hover to see numbers feature on a plain SVG file. Okay, cool. So what does that mean, Kix? I mean, plenty of other ways to do that. You can do that using WebRPC. You can do that with RESTful servers. Sure, but the idea is you want to make it easier for your other developers to integrate your code into theirs. Think about this. By using 0RPC, you won't really have to change the signature of how their code invokes, whether it's on PHP, whether it's on JavaScript, Java, Go. It's just like they're calling another function found within their own code. It doesn't feel like invoking something remotely. And that makes it real easy and real fast to work with cross-language projects. So some benefits. Of course, you have a single source of truth, which means that if you have to change something here, you don't have to change it there, and there. So if Alice wants to bump the number of potatoes in their listing to about 100, they can just change that in Bob's server, reload the server, and it automatically updates everywhere else because it's using that as an RPC server. Of course, you have code reusability, which is, again, a very important thing. You don't want your developers on another project to rewrite whatever code you write on your own project. That's just very detrimental to your development speed. And frankly, I don't know why anyone would do that, especially for a startup where time is key. And like I said, you can let your own Cardingis and Dodongs use their languages of choice without compromising development speed. And of course, scalability, but more on this later. What are the caveats? Of course, with every good, seemingly magic bullet thing, there are always caveats. There's added latency, right? Compared to just writing that code as part of your entire PHP project, you write it in Python because Python does something best, right? So that means that you have to do socket programming. You need to do, it needs to hop through layers of network interfaces, get back, and then reserialize. It's much, much slower than having it in a native process in your same project, but that's the trade-off for being able to code faster, right? So it's more of being able to write your code more easily. It's like you don't have to think about the code you write. You focus on designing your data, your infrastructure, without having to deal with cross-language stuff. And there are more moving parts because as opposed to having just one project with one single language, you have all these different projects that all connect to one central RPC server. And just like that famous law, Murphy's Law, if something is bound to go wrong, it will. And it holds true for a project with many moving parts. And finally, refactoring could be redacted. It's against our code of conduct. So, yeah, because if you have to change the data format, in this one part, say in your Python code, your server needs to change the way that it returns code over to its clients, you have to edit it out on both sides, right? You have to change your JavaScript code, you need to change your Python code, as opposed to, say, just changing it in one project. Again, guys, it's all just trade-offs, right? So let's look at zero RPC at scale. One of the best parts, which I personally like about zero RPC, as opposed to, say, Apache Thrift, Cap and Protobuf, is that you can easily just treat it as you would a web server. But instead of your web server that's talking to the public internet, you now have a server that talks to other parts of your server. And at scale, this means that the platform stack is straightforward. You can use your load balancer of choice, whether that's Haproxy. I read it as Haproxy, please don't correct me. Or maybe Elastic Load Balancer if you're on AWS, or a lot of other load balancing services which you like. And put your RPC servers on a single auto-scaling group. Again, if it's on AWS, you can just deploy it and forget about it. That way it's self-healing, it's self-scaling, it's self-upgrading. So you just have to write the code and forget about at least most of the infrastructure. So also, if you prefer containers like Docker or deploy with Kubernetes, you can just as easily orchestrate this. So instead of having individual EC2 instances, you can have containers running on a cluster and whatnot. So essentially, the load of it all is placed on your RPC servers instead of your web servers. And personally, I think that's great, because now you only have to dedicate the task of making sure that this RPC doesn't fall on the specific guys that actually work about processing on the back end. And you can let your less DevOps competent guys focus on writing the web front end and writing the web server. So all the meat is in the zero RPC. But again, this could be a bad thing, because you might accidentally introduce single points of failure, but you should be careful. So what are the main takeaways? In a startup with a diverse group of engineers, solutions such as zero RPC can let you unify your entire stack. Basically, it lets you treat Python as your universal backend. It lets you use Python as the backbone of your entire stack. It lets you use Python underneath whatever other languages that your developers prefer to use. And you can delegate functions and processes to languages and frameworks that do those functions best and lets you deliver features faster. For example, some people might argue that, Elixir and Phoenix is the best for a web server. It's blazing fast. But then Python is the best for data processing and so on. And then JavaScript is the best for socket communication and so on. You don't have to argue with them anymore. You can just say, cool story, bro. I agree. And you integrate everything together. There's less friction if you let everything work harmoniously, just as it was a long, long time ago when they were all living in harmony until the redacted attacked. And you don't have to be limited to a single language. So that's the main takeaway. So some final notes. All the images that I used for this presentation were taken from pexels.com, a royalty-free stock photo site. And if you're interested in playing with Potato List Stack, the one that Bob and Carding and Dodong wrote, not me, I didn't wrote those, they are available at this deck's GitHub repo. So you can download that. I'll just post it on our Python group later. And another thing, Bob's DB server is managed with Kenneth Reed's pipenv. Pipenv is great. You should try it, right? So you have a pip file, you have pip file lock. It's very interesting. I don't really fully understand how it works yet, but it's great. And Carding's Express.js server started out with me using Yarn as the package manager, because you won't argue with the fact that Yarn is fast and it definitely solves some of NPM's headaches. But at the moment, there are still some kinks that we need to work out with Yarn, because it doesn't work very well with zero RPC C bindings, and and Node refuses to work with it. So I had to go back to NPM. And initially, I wanted to build Dodong's analytics service, that PyChart. I wanted to build it with Go, Sadly, the zero RPC package for Go seems to be outdated, and I didn't have the time to try and solve it myself, and I don't even think that I could. So, thank you.